Hello, I'm here with Dr. Debra Osborne Spindle, PhD and Master of Library Information Sciences. She's a retired research librarian at the Oklahoma Historical Society. Thank you so much for joining us.
Glad to be here.
She's going to be speaking today. Her presentation is Finding the Girls, Records for Researching Women. And so I'm going to turn on her presentation and hide my camera, and we'll get started. Okay. So, Tiffany, could you just confirm for me that the slides are there?
Yes, we can see the slides.
Perfect. All right. Good. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Christina. It's a joy to be back here. I actually remember the way, and I've been retired for a while. I still come out here to research. So I'm happy to talk to you today about Finding the Girls. That may seem like kind of a flippant title, but we'll continue, and then you can tell me what you think. The history of women cannot be written without attention to women's relations with men in general, and their men in particular, nor without attention to the other women of their society. This from Elizabeth Fox Genevieve, and I thought, well, this sounds kind of like we're emphasizing the men instead of the women, but she's right. And she was recruited to start various women's studies departments in various universities. So I think she probably knows what she's talking about. We all have females in our research projects for whom we don't have maybe a maiden name or a family to fit them into. Females are just tougher to track. In the 19th and 20th centuries, they had few legal rights. When she married, everything she owned became her husband's, even the clothes on her back. Unless she was widowed or remained single, she could not enter into any legal contracts, including selling property inherited from her father or writing a will without her husband's consent. Legal custody of the children certainly belonged to the husband. So from a historical point of view, we must also research the woman's husband and every person he comes into contact with. There's no magic bullet. It takes perseverance and patience. You have to research the place. You have to research the men in her life, simply because men left more records. Finding these two girls, by the way, are my great aunts, and until the ends of their life, which you can see were fairly long, they were known as the girls. So that's part of where I came up with the name for this. I knew these women. They lived in the adjoining county where I grew up. I saw them a lot. And I thought I knew a lot about their lives, but I have found a lot about them after their passing that I didn't know. Property that they owned, and up there on the right, I didn't know she ever left Beaver County, Oklahoma, but she went to the Northwest and worked in an airplane plant during World War II. I wish I'd been able to ask her about that. It is a family affair. You have to talk to siblings, cousins, in-laws, and look for naming patterns. It was my uncle that told me about Aunt Edna going to the Northwest. So, if I hadn't been chatting to him about her, I'd have probably never known that. A community affair. This was especially true in earlier times. Today we use Facebook or the internet, at least in some fashion, and that becomes sort of our community. But historically, women particularly were parts of churches and clubs, and it's important to know about those. And it's important to look at the witnesses to documents that the women forged I don't mean forged, I mean, made. And look at the neighbors. And one of the things we look at, I'll talk about later, is that who are the neighbors, especially on census records. If they've moved, often they move with a group of people. I helped a woman reconstruct a club her mother had founded in the 1930s here in Oklahoma City just by looking at newspapers, because those club members, every time they met, there was an issue, there was an article in what used to be called the society pages of the newspaper. So we were able to track them all down. And then knowing the law, sometimes this is the most difficult piece to this, and understanding how it impacts what we're looking at. But I'll give you some tips on how to find what the law was at the time in that place. Looking at wills, land sales, marriage laws, taxes, and military records. Probably your females didn't serve in the military, but her men did, and maybe she got a pension as a result, or he did, and those pension records are gold. So we're going to look at 10 different types of records. These are listed for you on the handout, and some of them we'll spend a little more time on than others. So first, we're going to look at marriage records. Again, it's important to know the history of the place and to know the marriage laws. One of the things that you need to know is when do they start keeping records? And it's not always, reality doesn't always match the law. Sometimes marriage records were kept locally, but they weren't kept by the state. So you kind of have to dig around and look for those. Some states have indexes to all of their marriage records, and some do not. Oklahoma does not. Texas does not have a state index, but there are states that do. I would say that also marriage records are important because sometimes it's the only way you know that a woman or a man in some cases was married before. The woman might be using her first marriages, that name from that marriage, and sometimes the marriage record will ask what marriage this is, first or second or whatever. What is the age, the legal age that a female can marry or a male? For a long time, I would look at my parents' marriage record. They married in 1950, and one of each of their parents had signed, and I didn't understand why. But my mother was 17, and the legal age was 18. So her father had signed the marriage certificate. My dad was 20. The legal age was 21, and so his mother had signed the marriage certificate. I will say one of the best places that you can find this information is at FamilySearch.org. You may know about this resource. It's the resource from the Mormon Church. They have collected records, and they have written wonderful guides for how to find this information and what's available. I encourage you to check state libraries or archives. There are an index to some marriage records for Oklahoma County, for example, on the Oklahoma History Center's Research Library's website. It's not complete, but there are some. Check public libraries in places where your family lived. Before I worked at the History Center, I was the manager at the downtown library in the public library system here in Oklahoma City. And we had resources that I used to spend hours wondering how we could get the information out to the public so they would know. And for the most part, librarians they choose that profession because they want to help. Yes, there are some grumpy librarians in this world, I will admit that. But don't hesitate to call the public library in the area where your family lived and ask them what kind of information is available. I'm just going to show you a page from the Family Search Wiki. for each state, they have a wiki. And this is information for, I just chose Montana because sometimes those western states are hard to research. And this is just a tiny, tiny bit of what they have. You can see over on the right, they say, they kind of list, give you a choice to choose when you think the time period that the marriage occurred. And they tell you at the top that marriages are kept by the county clerk for each county, and that's true nationwide. County records are where marriage records are kept. And this says they begin at the creation of the county, but sometimes they've begun before that. 1943, there's a state index that begins. So, this is excellent information for you if you're just starting to research in a certain state. All right, let's talk about death records. And death records come in many shapes. We talk about death certificates, but you have to keep in mind that death certificates are kind of a modern thing. Supposedly, they started being kept in Oklahoma at statehood, but they're just not consistent. And they tend to be more consistent in populated areas. So if your person died in Oklahoma City in 1902, you're more likely to be able to find a death certificate than if they died out in the Panhandle. There are exceptions to that. But the other thing for you to keep in mind is that sometimes deaths are kept at the county level. In Texas, they kept birth and death certificates at the county level. And those records are what you find on Ancestry when you find a death certificate there or a birth certificate. So when you're looking at a death certificate, think about who the informant is. It's usually a family member. There often is a clue to a maiden name there. So think about that. If you're researching a woman, I recommend that you collect the death certificates for all of her children because the information will vary, but you will be able to get a picture of her. It may give the names of her parents, for example, and her maiden name. Consider the relationship of the informant to the deceased. The other thing you will find on a death certificate is where the person is buried and the funeral home. And those are two more wonderful resources for you to find information about your female that you're looking for. Okay. I will tell you that I did encounter a death certificate. Took me a while to figure out who the informant was, but he was a son-in-law. And then about halfway through that death certificate, he started supplying information based on his own mother instead of his mother-in-law. So just be careful. You have to analyze that death certificate, not take everything as gospel, but it's a place to start. This website, deathindexes.com, is a wonderful resource. It breaks down death records that are available online by state and then by county and sometimes by city, larger cities. For example, Cleveland Public Library has a wonderful index on deaths that occurred there, going back quite a ways, and it'll give you a little abstract of the death record, when and where they died, and sometimes the cause of death. So most of you probably know about Find a Grave, and that's another possibility. All right, cemetery records. This takes a little doing, but you'll get information that's important, like who bought the lot, and maybe the lot was purchased decades ago. One of my dad's family stories was him going to town to buy some lots. His dad asked him to go, no, his uncle asked him to go, And his dad said, well, while you're going, why don't you buy some for us? So there's these two huge plots in the cemetery, one for the Coopers and one for the Osbornes. But, you know, lots of my people are buried there. So who bought the lot? Who paid for the funeral? Who has the funeral records? In the small town where I grew up, it's been the same funeral home for years. And I always have to throw this in. Their name is Boxwell Brothers. Don't you think that's a wonderful name for a funeral home? They have funeral records going way back. And who is buried next to whom? This is pretty important. They're not always related, but they often are. So that's another puzzle for you to figure out. And sometimes that's how you find out where a person is buried, particularly if they don't have a headstone. So what is online? You probably know about Find a Grave. I encourage you to, again, do your due diligence with Find a Grave. Those are put up by volunteers and they're not always correct. I was working on a large family and their name was spelled about 3 different ways. In the records, they were not, but on Find a Grave, they were. Local county or city records sometimes are online, or you can call and ask. And sometimes large cemeteries have also digitized the records and put them online. So you just dig around a little bit to look for cemetery records. Shawnee here in Oklahoma has their cemeteries online, and you can look at who's buried next to whom, for example. This is an example I found of a cemetery record, and you can see that a lot of the information we talked about is here. And also, you get information about who their parents were, who the lot owner was. This is kind of new that you get a cause of death for the person. You get the time of the internment, which is kind of interesting. But these dates tell you when to look for an obituary. And you get the place of death, who they were married to, and then the relationship to the owner. So Rosina Fries is the owner, and this person was her grandson-in-law. So that's excellent information. You don't always get this, but if you have a relative in Cincinnati, you're in luck. So what about these are records that I found on Find a Grave. I was looking for the daughter in this family. Her father was always listed as NR, so I figured this was a good possibility. The name was unusual enough. I thought, well, this is probably her mother, but looking to see if they were buried next to each other, the pictures didn't tell me anything, and plot B and plot 371 didn't tell me anything. So I thought, okay, I'm gonna call the city office. So Waleika's a small town, but I looked online, Waleika City Hall, and called them up, and the police department answered. So just be prepared. They transferred me to the person I needed to talk to, and I confirmed that these people were married, and they were the parents of the person I was looking for. So perseverance is key here. Now, this is one of my favorite tombstones that I've ever found. What do you think? You know, when you look at who's buried next to whom, here we have John and Lena and Ed. Are these siblings? What's going on here? Well, I did a little more research, and Lena Unruh first married John, and he died, and then she married John's brother, Ed. So to solve this issue, I had to look at some more records and do a little bit more research. Now I want to show you a worksheet from a funeral home. I don't know if you've seen one of these. This is the worksheet for my great-grandmother. And my great-grandfather gave all this information. This is really special to me because it gives the name of her father and the name of her mother and their birthplace. And those people were born in Russia. And so these are Germans from Russia, which settled some of Western Oklahoma. And this was wonderful information for me. So, there's her father and there's her mother and where they were born. Now, this just says Russia, but maybe it was another document, but it told me where those people were born. And again, she died in Oklahoma, but this funeral home record is in Texas. So if they're close to a state line, keep that in mind as well. I had a woman in the library a few years ago who was searching and searching for someone who had died in Texas County out in the Oklahoma Panhandle. And I said to her, you need to look across the line and see across the state line and see if you could find them. And sure enough, that's where she found them. So don't get too fixated on the place if it's close to a state line. And I've lost the cursor on the
There you are.
computer.
You're down in this corner.
Yeah, but over here. Oh, there it is. No, yeah, there it is. Okay. Sorry, a little technical difficulty here. Okay, now we're going to talk about a more common kind of record, census records. Again, I encourage you to really work your census records. Most of what we look at are the federal census records that came out every decade starting in 1790. But also states often did censuses in between. So look and see if you can find those census records. Florida, for example, I know has census records in between. I will also say that if you're using Ancestry will not always pull up those state census records. They may be there, but they don't always pull them up. Their algorithms don't look that deeply. And so again, you can look at those wikis for each state on Family Search, and it will tell you what state censuses are available. State censuses are sometimes taken at statehood. I know there was one here in Oklahoma, but the only surviving part of that census is for Seminole County. So there's a 1907 Seminole County census, if you're interested in that. We have it here at the Historical Society. The other thing to keep in mind is that spelling is not important. Remember that you can search using gender or age or birthplace. You can search just using a first name if their first name is unusual. So keep that in mind when you're looking for people. Don't search only Ancestry or only Family Search. People don't remember to look in Family Search, but I think in some cases their indexing is better, and sometimes their images are easier to read. So you can also, if you have a subscription to Heritage Quest, one of the best things about Family Search is it's free. So just keep that in mind. I would also encourage you to look at the neighbors. We used to tell people to look a page before and a page after. Look at where those neighbors were born. And do they appear as neighbors in more than 1 year? Remember that census takers didn't always go through the neighborhood in the same way in 1900 as they had in 1880, for example. But it is important to look at the neighbors. Elizabeth Schoen Mills calls this the fan club, looking at family and neighbors. I would also encourage you to make use of city directories. And even if your family did not live in a city, there are county directories sometimes that are helpful. if you haven't used city directories, I refer to them as telephone directories on steroids because they provide where the person worked, they provide the name of the spouse, and where the spouse worked. And I've even seen some city directories for Edmond and Stillwater, for example, that tell you how many children and of what sex those children were, and what church those people were members of. So you never know what information you're going to find. All right, next we're going to look at at land records. And land records are not a record that we think of really when we are researching women, but don't neglect them. Collect the deeds of her family and read them carefully. This includes both her father and her husband. Be aware of dower, not dowry, but dower, which was a widow's share for life in her husband's estate. And when if that land was sold, supposedly the wife had to sign that she agreed. And as I say, supposedly she was examined apart from her husband to say if she agreed or not. So you can take that for what it's worth, but it was the law. Under what conditions could a female own land? Could she inherit from her father? I have a friend who lives in Indiana who says that his German grandmothers or great-grandmothers probably owned property, that their fathers left them property just to them. And even though it wasn't the law of the land, nobody interfered. So they were able to do with that land what they wanted. They could sell it if they wanted to on their own account. So keep that in mind. What was the culture of the area where your family was? And again, who lived in the neighborhood? Clues to follow up are adjacent landowners mentioned by name. Often when you look at a deed, it will say adjoining so-and-so's land. So think about who those people might be. Is your ancestor selling property? How did he acquire that land? I recommend that you keep what's called an in-out table for any ancestor. When did they buy the property and where did they get that property from? Maybe it was a land grant. And then what do they do with that property? Where is the property located? Explore the neighborhood. Identify the nearest town, local churches, schools, cemeteries. Topographical maps can give you that information. What is the date that the property was acquired? And keep in mind the property date of acquisition may be very different than the date of the deed being recorded. Sometimes property just passed down through the family and the deed never got recorded, which can give you a little bit of information about the family as well. So when they get ready to sell the land 3 generations later, they have to go back to the courthouse and get that deed recorded. The other thing for you to keep in mind is that sometimes when a courthouse burned, they took their deeds back to the rebuilt courthouse and re-recorded them. So again, knowing the history is key. Are there multiple sellers or buyers? It may be the sale of the family farm if there's lots of sellers. And keep in mind, it's probably going to be the husbands of the daughters. It's not necessarily going to be the daughters' names on there. And estate sale, the relationship may not be stated, but it's worth finding out who those are. I recommend that to find the law, you use Google Books, and I put this search down. Well, I don't know where it ended up on your handout. It might be on the top of a page rather than the bottom. But if you go to Google Books online and you search for session laws plus Missouri or plus Idaho, whatever state you're researching in, you will be able to find the session laws for that state. They'll list lots of them, but they'll give you the dates. So that's where you can find out what the laws were for who could own what. Okay, here is a case study. And it's not going to be very encouraging, I'll just tell you right now. Who is Adaliza Ellis? Adaliza married Elijah Gilbert Mobley in 1843 in Yazoo County, Mississippi. She was born in 1824 in Mississippi or Louisiana. You know, the census records vary. I lean toward Louisiana, but I don't know for sure. She died in 1898 in Grimes County, Texas. I have a copy of the marriage record, but it does not name her parents. And this marriage record is the only place I have seen her maiden name, and I'm assuming it's correct. I do know from experience that sometimes an orphan was raised by a family and they just assume their name, and there may be nothing in the legal records that notes that. I just don't know. Grimes County, Texas history does not name her parents. There's a nice write-up on the family, but it doesn't name her parents. I don't think anybody in my family knows her parents' names. There's no death record. She died before there were records were kept at the local level. So the issues I had here are, this is a very common surname, Ellis. And we're looking at pre-1850. By the 1850 census, which is the first census that lists everybody in the household by name, she's already married. So I'm up a stump here looking for Adaliza Ellis. So one of the things I did was I looked at the land where she lived. And you may or may not be familiar with these maps. They're pretty wonderful. They're family maps of Yazoo County, Mississippi. Greg Boyd, who used to live in Norman, now lives in Texas, publishes these maps through Arfax Publishing. I will also say that these maps might be available at your local library in either book form or online. The Metropolitan Library System here in Oklahoma County has these maps online under a database called History Geo. So, and you can search, by county, by surname, whatever. So here's a map of Yazoo County. And I thought, okay, this is a list of the original landowners. Well, at least the original landowners after they turned over Indian land to the federal government. So this one is for Yazoo County, which is where I know they were married, and her husband was born in this county. So who are the Mobleys in this county? The Mobleys are purple. See down there at the bottom. There's all kinds of Mobleys. The Scion Mobley is Elijah's father, and Fielding is his brother. And the greens up at the top are Ellis. So they're not too far away. A couple, 1, 2, 3 miles, section lines. All right. So we have Owen Ellis and William R. Ellis, and they got land in 1835. Remember, she married in 1847, so I thought, they might be her dad or they might be a brother. I just don't know. So I started researching these guys. Powhatan Ellis, 1833, he never married, and truthfully, I'm kind of glad she wasn't married to him. He had somewhat orthodox views of the relations of husband and wife. It may not be surprising to find him in the case of Bradley versus the state, holding to the old feudal doctrine that a husband might chastise an obstreperous wife, provided he used the rod no larger than the thumb. So I was kind of glad that Adaliza was it in his household? I researched Owen and William, both in Louisiana and in Mississippi, and I can't make it fit. So I'm still working on Adaliza, and in fact, I'm working on Adaliza with DNA. So we'll see how it goes. Adaliza had 11 kids, and descendants of nearly all of those children have tested with DNA, and we all match. But we still don't know much about the Ellis piece of our ancestry. All right, there are other land records online for you to know about. If you had ancestry in Texas, for example, the General Land Office has wonderful records for original landowners. And here in Oklahoma, the History Geo has these online, but they also have some of the tribal allotments that are indexed. I know that because I indexed a lot of the Cherokee Nation ones. Those are available in lots of different places, but it's just an example of the kinds of land records that you can find. Okay, the bad news is I still don't know about Adaliza's family, but I haven't given up. Church records, some of my favorite kind of records. If you can find birth or christening records, they may include a maiden name, and often those are held at a local level. So you might contact the actual church. Church newspapers are a place that get overlooked too much. Sorry, my allergies. Here in our collection of newspapers in the Historical Society, we have some church newspapers. This was fairly common that denominations published newspapers. I can remember going to my grandmother's house as a child and reading the Presbyterian newspaper. We have the Baptist Messenger here at Oklahoma, and we also have a Catholic newspaper. So they're not digitized, they're on microfilm, but they may have information in there about your family. I will also tell you that Chronicling America, the newspapers at the Library of Congress website, also has church newspapers. Marriage records may be available in those newspapers and nowhere else, and I'm going to show you some examples. There are also possibility for obituaries that aren't available anywhere else. Search for church archives. They might be local or they might be regional. I have a friend who's the archivist for a region of the Methodist Church, for example, in Texas. So I know of those. I've looked around a little bit to see what Presbyterian records are available. Again, there are national archives and then there are also state archives. The other possibility is that Family Search has microfilmed records. I was able to prove descendancy from a person who was in Texas before statehood by using some of the Family Search's records, microfilmed records of a small Presbyterian congregation in East Texas. Here's another example. This is not wonderful, but I'll tell you my experience. I went to the Virginia Baptist Historical Society, which is, of course, in Virginia, but it's in Richmond at the University of Richmond. They had wonderful, wonderful records for the early Baptist churches in Virginia. I don't think of the Baptist church as a record-keeping church, not like the Catholic Church, for example, when they record baptisms or christenings. But they did have what are called minute books. And at the time, those records were not microfilmed. They weren't even photocopied, and I could not photocopy them. So, and this is before digital cameras. This was a long time ago that I took this trip. But this was a record of people coming into Upper Essex Church in Essex County, Virginia, and who they married. And if you look, let's see, sometimes there was more than one record, and I was looking for my husband's family, and I knew he had Mordecai Spindles in his family, so there you go. Barbie Spindle, again, Barbie is an unusual first name, but I looked back a couple generations and Barbie was a female's surname who had married into the family. So this information I thought was pretty terrific. Down, you can just move on down here and see Miss Mordecai Spindle married Miss Dickinson in 1837. This was wonderful information because I didn't know her surname. So there you go. I was thrilled to find this, even though I had to do it by hand, and you can see it's not all that neat, but it is pretty early information from a Baptist church in Virginia. I also found my husband's, second great-grandfather getting kicked out for drinking, but that was after Miss Dickinson died, his wife, so, they took a little pity on him. So you never know what you're going to find in those records. All right. Here is another family story. When I was young, I spent time with my grandmother who lived in South Dakota, ran a country store. It was 17 miles to go get supplies to her store. So we spent a lot of time in the car. And she told me the story about her grandmother, whose name was Martha Jane, and who had been on a wagon train going to California, and her father was killed. Well, this was just a fascinating story to me, and I tell you, I spent a lot of time trying to document that story. After I had documented it, I found this story in newspapers, but it was after newspapers started to be digitized, which took a while. But you can see that this is written by a correspondent from the New York Tribune. It was published in a Salt Lake City newspaper. A company from Warren County, Iowa, and I knew that's where they were from. And then it lists who they're from, and the name of the family I was looking for was Ball. So there you go. And over on the right-hand column, you can see, and of the immigrants that were killed, John Ball, who left a wife and 2 children, there was actually only one, and Thomas Ball, whose wife and family are in Warren County. Well, that's a whole other story why his wife didn't go along, but John Ball was my ancestor. And my grandmother didn't know his name, so this was terrific that I was able to find this information. Now, one of that child of John Ball, Martha Jane, is the person who told my grandmother this story. And she told my grandmother that her mother had remarried, but she didn't remember the name. And then her mother died. So you can see that the date on this is 1862. On the 1870 census, Martha Jane is living back in Warren County, Iowa, with her grandparents. Now, if I didn't know this part of the story, I would never have realized what went on between 1860 and 1862. But when I started looking at probate records in Iowa, this is what I found. W.G. Ball, administrator for J.W. Ball. And I knew that John Ball's father's name was William Green Ball. So there's William Green administering his son's estate. And down here at the bottom in the circle is Elizabeth Noakes. So there is Elizabeth's new family name. And here's another receipt for J.W. Ball, name of widow and heirs, Elizabeth A. Noakes, widow. And this tells me where she was, California in El Dorado County. Well, I hied myself over to the Western History Collection and looked at this history, and sure enough, there was a write-up about this wagon train and the people who survived. And there's Martha, age 7, also in El Dorado. The thing I didn't know is that John and Thomas's brother went with them. He survived. He went back to Warren County, and when Elizabeth died, he was sent out to California to get Martha Jane. And this is right at the time of the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, and they took the train back. So I haven't confirmed that that's what they did, but I do know that they took the train back. So, you know, it's fascinating to me. So there's a way that I found a maiden name, a married name. Looking through probates. Now, let's see. The other thing I encourage you to look at, we don't necessarily think about military records when we're researching women, but I will tell you that the pension records for soldiers are a gold mine of information about women and their families. The Revolutionary War, the men got pensions, and one of the ways to look at those, we have the DAR microfilm in the library here, but those also have been put online. The thing to keep in mind about those records is that they've been microfilmed 2 or 3 times, and so you should look at them all. Now this is old, I didn't catch this. It says C footnote, that should be fold 3 because they changed their name. And there's an index at Ancestry. There's also an index at an index online at the DAR library. And I have put that website on your handout. The War of 1812, there's an index on Ancestry, and fold 3 has the records. They're not complete. They had started digitizing them, and then you know what hit, so they took a break, but they've resumed digitizing those. And then there are also Civil War widows' pensions. The Union pensions came from the federal government. Excuse me, and the Confederate pensions were provided by the individual states. And we're going to look at some of these. Here is an example of a DAR library index for John Mitchell. You can see what this tells you, and this information comes from people who have joined the DAR based on John Mitchell being their ancestor. So it gives his birth and place and date, and also his death date and place. It gives you his pension number and who he served with and where he was living, and then down at the bottom it tells you who his wife was, and it provides the maiden name. So if you never look at anything else except the index, you've got the person's maiden name there, and you've got where they were living, so you can look at additional records in those places. We're going to see John Mitchell, or John Mitchell's grandson, also named John Mitchell, a little bit later. Let's look at a War of 1812. This is a pension application. I had no idea who John Benjamin Cromwell's wife was. I knew her name was Jane, but that's all I knew. I also did not know that he had lived in Georgia, but you can see that his service is from the Georgia militia. And down at the bottom, it tells you various places he's lived, and it tells you the maiden name of the wife, Jane Galbraith, and it tells you where they got married and the date, Greene County, Georgia. Now, up in the upper right-hand corner, it gives you information on bounty land. He got his bounty land in Arkansas, so that helped me know how the Cromwells ended up in Northwest Arkansas. All right, next is, well, I forgot to double click here. Next is, this is an index card. I think this is probably from Ancestry. These are on Ancestry. Lots of places, they're probably on Family Search too. If they served for the federal government, meaning not the Confederacy, there will be this card. Now, one of the things I want to point out here is where it says what I used to think was invalid or invalid, I didn't know, but that's what they called the soldier. So instead of putting soldier, they put invalid, and that gives you the date they applied, 1881, and it gives you the application number, and that's the information you will need to order his pension file. Then in 1917, the widow applied for a pension. Well, what does that mean? That means that the soldier died probably the end of 1916 or the first part of 1917. So pay attention again to all parts of this. Next, I'm going to show you a Confederate pension application. Confederate pensions were administered by the states. Oklahoma did not start Confederate pensions until 1915. So that's pretty late. My great-great-grandfather who served from Alabama, it didn't matter where you served. What it mattered was where you were living. So my great-great-grandfather was living in Beaver County, Oklahoma, and he applied, and he got his $350, and he promptly went back to Alabama. So just keep in mind that those pensions are administered by the state. The Texas ones were administered by Texas. I ordered this from the Texas archives. At the time, they were not microfilmed. They have since been microfilmed and indexed. One of the great things that I learned here was that she had had a second marriage. I had no idea. And my great aunt, who was her granddaughter, did not know either. And the witnesses were her brothers, and they had also served with him. So this was great information for me to know. See, you can see she's written in up above, married W.J. Howell in 1890. He was a Confederate soldier. He left me in, and then she's written down the side. So she's hoping between her husband and her second husband, who was also a Confederate, that she can get a pension. And she was rejected the first time, but she did finally get one.
We only have a few minutes left.
Oh, pardon?
We only have a few minutes.
Okay, I'm gonna speed it up.
That's all.
Sorry, I get carried away. And newspapers, I can get carried away with. Look at newspapers. They were the internet of the day. And you will find so much information in there. I solved a problem once looking at the military news information in the McAllister newspaper. They always had a column. When I was a kid, I wanted to know what it meant when people were publishing notices like "I will not be responsible for deaths other than my own." It was probably a divorce. This is just an example of an index that the WPA did for religious newspapers. So this enabled me to find obituaries from my husband's family. I don't know what great-grandmother this is, but there she is, tells you where she died, how old she was. The little phrase there about she was an indulgent mistress indicates there were enslaved people in her household. So you get all sorts of clues here. Look for naming patterns. I did not know the name of William Greenwald's mother. He was born in 1806 in New York City, of all places. I didn't know what his mother's name was. These are all of his siblings. Should have gotten a clue from looking at these. I finally found this death notice in a New York City newspaper. She died in Indiana, but her death notice is in New York City because that's where she was from. So Mrs. Ann Pamela Ball, there was her name. And I go back and look at her descendants in larger type and print, look at all those Ann Pamelas or some version thereof. I think Isabel was Mr. Ball's mother's name, older Mr. Ball. So know the names of the family members, make a timeline, ask around, ask relatives, ask neighbors. If they were in a small community, you'll be surprised at what the people who live there still remember. Explore records. I'll just say that more than once I've been asking a question at the library and somebody will step right in and answer it for me that doesn't work there. So explore what kind of records are available, investigate her associates, search databases smartly, and read diaries and letters. And I have more, but we're gonna stop there.
Thank you so much. This
You are
is
so
wonderful
welcome.
content. And